Hello and welcome to Frank's School, 115th day of the 6-year first video. Hydra in my head attacks. This looks like a mess, and it is a mess, but I'm going to erase stuff as I deal with it, and that might help a little bit. Now the plot thickened big time, and there was a casualty, more than one probably. Anyway, from 1971, that's when Joyce and I got back from Brazil, from the Peace Corps. Up until that particular date, April Fool's Day of 1974. That's what I'm talking about almost exclusively. The Peace Corps had a term, readjustment. There was even money set aside to help Peace Corps volunteers readjust once they got out of the Peace Corps and came back into, almost said the real world. Well, we had a readjustment allowance. And I never readjusted, is kind of the truth to it. The allowance, I mean, that helped or didn't help, I don't know. But I never readjusted. I came back, in some ways, I think a little bit like the Vietnam veterans that came back and were mistreated, and so many of them never really readjusted from their experience. Well, of course, Peace Corps was different, but it was traumatic. In a similar way. There was no way I was going to go back to the academic world of Harvard. I had hated Harvard. Now, I had studied intensely. You could say, in a sense, I almost did my doctorate work, master's and doctorate work while I was in Peace Corps, but not for any particular credit. I became a carpenter and was very happy with that. And a stonemason. I also learned to tape drywall. I learned a lot of those skills. The first guy I worked for was a man named Don Booth, a Quaker from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania, but living in New Hampshire. A good man. He wouldn't pay his taxes as long as the Vietnam War was going on. As a Quaker, he said he couldn't do that. You can't do that. And his foreman was a wonderful. He had a good crew. As a matter of fact, I learned the. I get used to the idea of being on a crew, a carpentry crew, and I really liked it. That was fine. Of course, I wasn't making very much money. Now, this was the time of hippie communes, they were nicknamed. A lot of young people were very discontent at that time. And they would form various communes and stuff. Virtually all failed. Almost all of them failed. I mean, if you want to go into the general culture, here you've got Woodstock, and the music says so much that kind of lyrics are coming out of the end of the 60s. But all right, but anyway, hippie communes, they were appealing in a way. I looked into it, except I was bound to this land. It wasn't, the inheritance war was still going on. I mean, it lasted for, I don't know, 9-10 years. Helen and Scott Nearing, they were very influential in general to these young people at that time. They wrote a book called Living the Good Life. Wendell Berry was another writer who similarly made it seem so appealing, that good life. The book Small is Beautiful had been written earlier. Shoemaker, I think, was the name who wrote that. I don't know if I ever actually read that, but it was part of that thinking about rejecting what normally people would think of as success. Now, during this time, J.W. Forrester, he and Dennis and his wife Donella Meadows, they developed systems dynamics. They worked in MIT. I studied it. I understood it thoroughly, I really think. The book Limits to Growth came out of that. And, continued to be influential right up to today in a way, but I don't want to talk about today yet. I want to talk about this intensive time at that point. The Club of Rome was part of what made all this kind of stuff possible. And what it did was it came up with a way to follow energy or material flow through systems. Using a computer and using symbols to show where does all this stuff flow. Now I hate to erase this in a way because I'm going to come back to it, but this all looks so complicated, so I thought maybe should. It was around this time in the late 60s, I guess early 70s, that a computer chip developed. I remember being in Brazil wishing so much I even had a hand calculator because I was doing a lot of calculation. I had to do it out longhand, really. me jump over to this guy. At some point, I don't know exactly where it was, I ran into the word decentralism. Ralph Borsodi was a man who lived and did most of his work in the beginning of the 20th century, and he was a good writer, very influential. He basically started that idea of decentralism. One of his books that has a catchy title is Flight from the City. Get out of the city. You know, I'll tell you right today, this morning before I did this class, my apprentice tells me that he's required at the moment to read a book called The Triumph of the Cities, I think, and he's studying sustainability. It's unbelievable, really, but I'll say more about that later. Anyway, Ralph Borsodi, he was helped, and he was influenced considerably by India, Gandhi. Mildred Loomis took up his work, and almost like a disciple of his, they formed a school of living. I think I actually heard, I heard Scott Nearing speak once, and I did communicate by letter with Mildred Loomis. There is a new school of living, but that didn't completely die. Thomas Kuhn, he wrote an essay in the early 60s, I think, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he came up with this idea that change doesn't occur gradually, but it changes by surge, where there's a paradigm shift, and then everything changes, as opposed to this idea that, well, science just continually gets wiser and wiser and accumulates stuff. Very influential, and that term paradigm shift came up. People still argue about that, but as a result of this and the computer chip, I reconnected with an old high school buddy of mine named Gary Fitz. He and I had gone to Concord High School together, and together we worked on a Homestead Engineer's Handbook. He was a mathematician, or is, and he devoted a lot of time to this too, complete with systems dynamics, and using a mainframe computer at Dartmouth, where he went, to run certain programs through there as we were experimenting with this. Well, the effort to this was huge. I thought about getting the ring binder. I was about that thick, huge thing. But eventually what I did was I wrote the first 50 pages of it. I actually wrote it out instead of just notes. It was an introduction, and I later called it the Decentralist Manifesto. And if you would like to see it, it's online. I read it. I actually put the camera there, and you can't see it so well, so I read it aloud through the Decentralist Manifesto. Eventually, without Gary, really pretty much without Gary at this point, I went on then to write a much shorter thing called Wedges Paradigm, which is also online. You could see it. Very hard to understand. Now, at this point, Joyce and I went back overseas. We went to Venezuela to see on an island in the Caribbean, Margarita, and there we tried to do the same sort of thing that we had so much success with in Brazil, but it was a failure. It did not work, and we came home, and then I started once again off to be a carpenter, and took jobs like I was a bartender for a while. Joyce waited table for a while, but then gradually she was able to finish her preparation to be an occupational therapist, which is what she then spent her life doing. Well, it was around this time that there was this great recession that occurred in the early 70s, and the Arab oil embargo was about at that same time. And finally, I lost my job as a carpenter. I was unemployed. It was at that point that I finally just said, that's all right, I'm going to the farm. I'm going to Pennsylvania. All of this was being done in New Hampshire. We lived one winter, I winterized a cabin in a summer place really on a Lake Sunapee in New Hampshire, and we lived there. But but eventually I just said, no, that's it. I'm going to that farm. If my mother and father will allow me to go there as their agent, I'll go to that farm, and we'll see about finishing off this inheritance war. The casualty was that Joyce did not come with me. Joyce did not come with me. She said, I won't go there. And the marriage ended ultimately. And it was strange because neither one of us had particular animosity toward the other. It was just she had in many ways been very brave in going through all this stuff with me, but she was not going to go there. So that day, I erased it. That day I ended up back here on the farm, supported by my family, but Hydra we'd had quite a battle, and it went on for a while. Bye for now.